The Contemporary Arts Center and director Dennis Barry are charged with obscenity for 7 pictures in the Robert Mapplethorpe art exhibit.
It says that only 5% of the artists in the modern art section are women, but 85% of the nudes are female.
I'm here because I'm queer and I'm mad as hell about all this.
This is a man who smokes Marlboro cigarettes. What kind of a man is he?
In the history of art, it's not really a history of art, it's a history of power.
Two things that often aren't considered in the same train of thought are museums and sex. Some people might see museums as inherently sexless, with long, boring rooms filled with paintings, a few rusty metal objects, and a very bored-looking docent. These are places of education, civilization, and culture, and sex never crosses into that territory, right? But of course, this could not be further from the truth. Museums are filled with expansive discussions of sexuality and gender, even if it isn't overtly stated. Museums have struggled to accurately interpret art, culture, and people for a very long time. And over the last several decades, that has changed drastically as what is socially acceptable has evolved. Today, I want to discuss a few topics that have historically been left out of museum displays, specifically concerning sex and sexuality. This video is a collaboration between myself and a dear friend of the channel, Amelia, who is a trans historian and the founder of Not Your Average Sistery, her home for exploring transgender museum practices by bridging the gap between trans studies and museum studies. In this video, we want to examine the status quo when it comes to museums, gender, and sexuality, but also dig a little bit deeper into the things that we don't question. We will be talking about how museums interact with nudity, sexuality, and gender, and also how social media has changed the game. This video has 2 parts. Amelia and I want to discuss sexuality and gender and how they have been woven into the very fabric of what a museum is in some very interesting ways that you might not expect. There is a very high likelihood that despite this video being educational in nature, that it will become demonetized. So please consider supporting the channel and Amelia in any way that you can. This can be as simple as checking out the museum's discourse playlist that I've put together, subscribing to the channel, checking out Amelia's website, or you can also make a one-time donation through my Ko-fi account. Any revenue generated from the Ko-fi account until my next video comes out is going to be split between myself and Amy. If you are seeing this video in the future and you want to make sure that Amy gets her cut, when you make your donation, please just add a little note and I will ensure that she gets her share of the revenue. But without further ado, let's dive into this discussion of museums and sex. Museums, at their base function, are places where history is interpreted for the general public. They are places of education, often focusing on specific cultures or people, or they are very broad, encyclopedic in nature, covering vast periods of time and place. I have talked about the history of the museum on this channel before, but it was quite a while ago and there were certain aspects that I glossed over. I didn't really talk about who was running these places or how they were interpreting things, though that topic has shown up fairly frequently on my channel over the last couple of years. But just as a little bit of a refresher, the modern museum began as a way for scientists, historians, and archaeologists to collect samples and then display them. They began as a cabinet in an upper-class Victorian drawing room, but over the last 200 years, the museum has become a staple in practically every large city on the planet. How we have interpreted history in these institutions has changed quite drastically since its humble beginnings in an upper-class drawing room, but the last few decades have been especially noteworthy. This shift in museums and society in general has come about for a variety of different reasons, but it generally comes down to new voices entering the field and sharing new perspectives, as well as a societal shift in acceptability as what is acceptable to discuss in a public forum has changed drastically over the last couple of years. I once had an anthropology professor who said that in a society where sex is taboo, death is openly discussed. And in contrast, in a society where sex is more prominent, discussions about death are held in private. The Victorians, for example, were known for being quite prudish about sex and sexuality, yet their mourning practices extended deep into societal culture, especially for the upper classes. The creation of memento mori and elaborate mourning practices were very much at the forefront, while discussions of sex and sexuality were held behind closed doors or in the closet. In comparison, if we look at the modern day United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, etc., sex is everywhere. Sure, you can take time off to attend a funeral if someone close to you dies, but after that, you're kind of just expected to get on with it. Sex, on the other hand, is everywhere. And like that infamous marketing technique, sex sells. But what does this have to do with museums? Are museums sexy? In Jennifer Tybergsy's book, Sex Museums, she argues that all museums are in fact sex museums. Tybergsy writes, "In museums, hierarchical structures of race, gender, sex, and class are so intricately enmeshed in the architecture and layout of the space that the always ongoing process of constructing sexual normalcy becomes invisible, background, or seemingly natural." Basically, Jennifer's book says that when we look at the status quo of how sex and gender are performed in museums, we can create a cultural study of how these structures and practices become institutionalized through display. So yeah, anyway, welcome to our cultural study.
Yes, there's a party going on at Mrs. Betty Martin's house. It's a Tupperware party, and it's really fun.
Do women have to be naked to get into the Met Museum?
I'm a guy who likes to work on my car.
The girls get together.
When we talk about history, there is an unspoken discussion of gender, whether we realize and acknowledge it's there or not. If we look at the history of museums specifically, we encounter gendered job positions, displays, and, well, people who have gender. In my video, Egypt's Forgotten Egyptologists, where I discuss the early history of Egyptology as a field, all of the museum curators, historians, and antiquarians that I discussed were men. Which isn't to say that women weren't present, but they were expected to stay on the sidelines. Early museums rarely had space on their employment lines for women unless it was secretarial, menial, or women's work. According to Women and Museums by Kate Hill, an examination of women working in museums between the middle of the 19th century and the First World War indicates that they were underqualified and regarded as unprofessional, but superlatively cheap or free labor. They were recognized as good at tasks such as boring, mundane work, fine work with their hands, and traditionally female tasks involving cleaning, children, and communication, especially with other women or the working classes, but were not seen as suitable for curatorial roles because of the leadership, research, and commitment such positions required. Women also visited museums, of course, and indeed they donated a wide variety of objects to these institutions, in particular natural history specimens. While women were certainly not uninvolved in museums, one of the most prominent ways that they were present in these spaces was in the displays themselves. Presented as the muses of great painters and sculptors, the female nude in particular has long held a high position in European art, going so far as to be referred to as the, quote, ideal art form by English art historian Kenneth Clark. When you enter an encyclopedic museum, such as the British Museum, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, or the Louvre, you are most likely going to see a female nude at one point or another, either in the form of a statue or a painting. And it is important to note the difference between being naked and being nude. According to Ways of Seeing by John Berger, to be nude is to be seen naked by others and yet not recognized for oneself. A naked body has to be seen as an object in order to become a nude. The sight of it as an object stimulates the use of it as an object. Nakedness reveals itself. Nudity is put on display. To be nude, according to Berger, requires a spectator. Whether that spectator is the artist or the owner of the art piece or just a casual museum visitor, they have historically been imagined as male. This imagined relationship between that of a spectator and an object, a man and a feminine nude, has influenced how feminine nudes have been seen for centuries. As an example, let's take a look at The Birth of Venus by Sandro Botticelli, an image you most likely have seen wherein Venus, the Roman goddess of love, beauty, desire, fertility, stands on a seashell, hair flowing down her back while she is flanked by angelic creatures. She is presented nude, hands covering her genitals and breasts, although ineffectually as one breast remains visible. While everyone else in the painting is looking at her, she stares forward, meeting the gaze of the spectator. We are probably all aware of this painting already due to its large stature within pop culture and media. I mean, according to Amelia, it even exists in Animal Crossing. But if we take a moment to fully consider the implications of the title of this painting, The Birth of Venus, she is born as a fully formed woman, boobies and all. Her sexuality is present from the very start, from the moment that she is born, and it is directed towards the viewer. Moreover, in museum conversations about the birth of Venus, the woman who modeled for this painting is herself minimized. In the description from the Uffizi Gallery website in Italy, where the birth of Venus is on display, the only people mentioned are Botticelli, the artist, and the Medici family who might have commissioned it. The model is theorized to be a noblewoman from Genoa, but it is not deemed important enough to mention in the description. The model herself is interchangeable, irrelevant in the grand scheme of things, merely a fun fact. The men in the story of this painting are treated as individuals. The skills of the artist and the taste of the patron are identified as unique to them, whereas the woman, the model whose beauty informs the entire piece, is treated simply as an object to be painted. As our friend Berger states in his book, "Men act, women appear." In the early days of the modern museum, even live women were put on show in racially charged displays that sought to ascribe negative characteristics to women and non-white ethnicities. The most prominent and, quite frankly, abhorrent example of this lies with the Hottentot Venus, or a woman by the name of Saartje Baartman, who was a woman taken from Kambedu, a Dutch colony on the eastern Cape of South Africa. Saartje was paraded across Europe through various displays while she was alive in order to showcase her, quote, strange, feminine, and non-white features. According to a newspaper clipping from the Times, she is dressed in a color as nearly resembling her skin as possible. The dress is contrived to exhibit the entire frame of her body, and the spectators even invited to examine the peculiarities of her form. Even the name emphasized this display. By referring to her as Venus, she is sarcastically referred to as the epitome of beauty. And then by attaching Hottentot, an outdated, offensive Dutch term that refers to the Kwe people of Africa, it really brings the white supremacist message to the front. After Saartje died in 1815, her skeleton and a body cast of her likeness was put on display and remained there for people to see until 1976. Truly a nude that epitomized the colonialism of the era. You will be relieved to know that in 2002, Saartje's remains were repatriated back to South Africa and finally laid to rest. In the 1970s and 80s, there were more and more conversations happening about history, museums, and gender. We saw this with the remains of Saartje, but another example comes to us in the form of a group known as the Guerrilla Girls. According to their website, the Guerrilla Girls are anonymous artist activists who use disruptive headlines, outrageous visuals, and killer statistics to expose gender and ethnic bias and corruption in art, film, politics, and pulp culture. Their most famous stunt included the use of an iconic feminine nude, a painting called Grand Odalisque on a vibrant yellow background. Notably, the painting is depicted with a gorilla head and the question, "Do you have to be naked to get into the Met Museum?" in large bold letters, accompanied by statistics of women artists whose works are on display versus the number of feminine nudes on display. They reissued this poster with updated statistics in 2005 and 2012, and it just goes to show that really not much has changed. When Amelia and I initially started working on this script, I had actually never heard of the Guerrilla Girls, but I think that this is a really great way to round out our discussion of women and the male gaze in museums. For International Women's Day in 2024, the Met released a short video on these posters, and I left a comment asking what the statistics are like in 2024, and I have yet to receive a response. As we have discussed, the perspective of what is on display in museums, how items are presented, and the interpretation that accompanies these pieces has historically been very male. However, there has been a significant shift in how museums tackle gender, especially with the rise in acceptability of our non-binary pals. A wonderful example of this involves the Humble Heritage House Museum. These places are steeped in gender and sexuality, which is odd because at first glance these places are really not very sexy. And yet, sex informs the narratives, because a family tree is often used as a guide in these types of places. And what is a family tree if not a history of sex? Gender and sexuality are most commonly found at historic house museums through the traditional way they are organized, by families and patriarchal lineages that are generally more interested in sharing the man's work than the women's work. If you are a regular viewer of this channel, I do apologize because you're probably tired of me saying this, but I used to work at a heritage house museum called Point Ellis House. When I gave tours explaining the history of the site and the family that lived there, I talked about the O'Reillys and how 3 generations lived there over the course of 108 years. And when I talked about them, I would generally start with the patriarch, Peter O'Reilly. He was the breadwinner, the politician, the guy who did important things. And after I was done talking about him, I would then go down the family tree. I would talk about his wife, Caroline O'Reilly. I would talk about his 2 daughters, Mary and Kathleen, and then his 2 sons, Frank and Jack. There is a lot to talk about when it comes to Point Ellis House due to its very inherent colonial nature, but there's a very interesting way that we can examine this family, especially if we look at them through a gendered lens. Especially when it comes to the eldest daughter, Kathleen. Before the historical society that I worked for took over Point Ellis House, all interpretation that had to do with Kathleen was relegated simply to her suitors, the men who sought her hand in marriage. None of these suitors were successful, despite at least one of them proposing, because Kathleen ultimately chose not to marry at all, a very unusual circumstance in the 19th century. However, when we were re-examining the O'Reilly family history, we realized that we really didn't know much about Kathleen at all. We knew about the exploits of Harry Stanhope, a man who proposed to her but who she ultimately rejected. We know tons about the exploits of Robert Scott, another of her suitors. But Kathleen herself remained a bit of a mystery. Which is odd because there are dozens of her diaries, her letters to friends and family at the BC Archives. There is a wealth of material written by her own hand, in her own words, that share her life experience. Kathleen's belongings are frozen in time at Point Ellis House, and they can paint a picture of a very well-lived life. People just hadn't really bothered to look past her suitors to see Kathleen before. We added to the narrative of Kathleen O'Reilly. We didn't get rid of any of that stuff about the suitors, but we re-centered her as the focus of her own life story. We talked about how she traveled the world and was a very talented artist, and how in my second year at Point Ellis House, I found a certificate from the Canadian Red Cross that showed that she had been a volunteer in England during the First World War. Kathleen O'Reilly is just one example of a historical figure being examined under these new lenses of gender and sexuality in the 21st century. And I sincerely believe that by highlighting the successes and failures of people who have historically been absent from museum displays, we are creating a more enriching and valuable history for the general public to learn about and consume. Speaking of acceptability, let's talk about sex and sexuality.
Then went into the middle of Main Street and stopped traffic, doing things deliberately designed to shock Middle America.
What is acceptable to display in museums has changed drastically over the years. Historically speaking, what was acceptable to display in museums fell within a very rigid corridor of heterosexual, white, male Christian interests. And while this is still the dominant view in most museums, things are opening up little by little. While a heterosexual male gaze is often what is most catered to in museums, the queer gaze has been relegated to subtlety, relying on symbols and euphemisms to get their point across. When it comes to displaying or not displaying queer histories, stories, and objects, Jonathan D. Katz, a pillar in the field of queer art history, uses the term covert censorship. Censorship on its own is often imagined as like an external threat, something that is done to us, something that garners attention and can be pushed back against. Meanwhile, covert censorship comes from within an institution, festering behind closed doors where it's often a lot harder to push back against. The fact is that only reckless museums censor. Savvy museums, and they are in the vast majority, censor art vastly more often. But they do so long before that art ever gets mounted onto walls, made into shows, and given an institutional life. In fact, this covert censorship is the lifeblood of the museum world, the immune system that works to keep its entire body politic free of difference, which is itself the disease. But because this covert censorship occurs in boardrooms, directors' offices, and other sites shielded from public view, we never hear about it and can pretend it simply doesn't exist. In his article, Queer Curating and Covert Censorship, Katz describes his experience co-curating a queer-themed exhibition at the Smithsonian National Portrait Gallery in 2010 as a prime example of this type of censorship. The exhibition, titled Hide-Seek: Difference and Desire in American Portraiture, is described as charting the underdocumented role that sexual identity has played in the making of modern art and highlights the contributions of gay and lesbian artists to American art. As the first ever queer show at a national museum in the United States, Katz and his co-curator, David Ward, knew that this exhibition would cause controversy. In an attempt to curb any attacks that might come their way, the two curators went for a relatively restrained exhibition, going so far as to ensure that all nude pieces were done by straight artists, with the idea that they would be more palatable to conservative critics. Our enemies had come to understand that naked homophobia was, by 2010, a politics of diminishing returns. So they camouflaged their old-school homophobia in the guise of religious offense and improbably claimed that, in fact, our exhibition was an attack on them, on the Catholic Church, and on Christianity in general. Despite their best efforts to curb controversy, Christian critics in particular took umbrage with a scene from an avant-garde film that was playing in the exhibition called A Fire in My Belly, by noted queer artist David Wojnarowicz, that displayed ants crawling over a crucifix. Parties such as the Catholic League and Republicans Eric Cantor and John Boehner issued several complaints, and the edited film was pulled from the exhibition against the threat of reduced funding for the Smithsonian. This film was pulled from the exhibition without any consultation with either the curator or even the director of the Smithsonian, with many other museums protesting this move by exhibiting the film. However, in Katz's words, in solidarity with the censored art, a number of institutions bought and screamed the Wojnarowicz film, thereby publicly allying themselves with an artist they never showed, hosted, nor screened when he was alive. But even more galling, I knew that many of these protesting large museums had utterly refused to cooperate with Hide-Seek before the censorship battle, denying all loan requests. Although the exhibition was called Hide-Seek after a celebrated eponymous 1948 painting by Pavel Tchelichou in the Museum of Modern Art's collection, the MoMA refused to lend the titular painting and indeed refused all loan requests. Nonetheless, it bought and screened the film and earned positive press for so doing. So these other museums got to pretend that they were not also censoring queerness by publicly and very loudly displaying a queer artist after a controversy. Meanwhile, they could continue to refuse to do their own queer programming without putting in any of the effort or the risk. A manifestation of covert censorship that we see very often in museums today is this idea of admitting uncertainty. Admitting uncertainty is a literary technique for text writing that allows the author to hint at a complexity and invite the reader to ask questions about what meanings can be found. On the surface, it is a fine technique that allows an institution to admit that not everything can be known, while also inviting the audience to engage with an object on a deeper level. But frequently, this technique allows queer interpretations of histories and objects to be brushed aside. Take, for example, this accompanying text panel for a John Singer Sargent painting located in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. Here, the possible queerness is introduced as literally the last word, with no further discussion of why there were critical questions around his sexuality. Sargent, whom Wikipedia wonderfully describes as a lifelong bachelor, found his muse in McKellar, but the label refuses to suggest that they might be lovers, instead stating that they work together repeatedly, usually nude. Admitting uncertainty is not a neutral act, because it can prioritize certain interpretations over others. What we see with this Singer label is that their work relationship was prioritized, one between the artist and his muse, with a potentially personal relationship being left unsaid and reduced to critical questions. In essence, the sex that underpins this painting, the sex that informs how lovingly McKellar is painted, is completely erased or forced to the margins. Despite this silencing from the art canon, artists have used a number of symbols and euphemisms to suggest their queerness. Phrases like lifelong bachelor, spinster, and close companion hint towards queerness, while visual references to Saint Sebastian or Sappho do similar. At a time when homosexuality was criminalized, symbols like these allowed queer artists to express their queerness in coded ways. This recognition, along with obstruction from museums to explicitly label queer art, has inspired museum designer Margaret Middleton to design the zine, Looking for Queer Possibility in the Museum. This guide encourages visitors at museums to let their own queer experiences inform the queerness they find, using gaydar, or a queer spidey sense, if you will, as a way of knowing. Instead of waiting for the museum to catch up, Middleton offers visitors the tools to find queer sexuality, queer history, and queer identity based upon what they already know, letting their past experiences guide their interpretation of what they're seeing. In this way, the visitor is able to find their own queerness in the gallery, whether the museum wishes to recognize it or not. We can explore Middleton's technique by returning to Kathleen O'Reilly and exploring how she has been interpreted through the lens of sex and sexuality. Kathleen, despite having numerous suitors and at least one proposal for marriage, never married. There is no confirmation of this in her own words, but it is theorized that Kathleen O'Reilly was not interested in men. Or women. Or anyone, really. We know that at least one of her contemporaries, Eleanor Dunsmuir, was a lesbian who spent a lot of time in Europe, where homosexual relationships had more of an opportunity to flourish, in spite of the fact that it wasn't socially acceptable at the time. However, several of my Point Ellis House colleagues and I had our in-house, unpublished theory that Kathleen O'Reilly was simply not interested in sex or relationships. Of course, modern labels like asexual and aromantic were not present in those days. But what is clear from her personal writings is that Kathleen loved her family. She loved Point Ellis House, and marriage of any sort would take her away from her home, and so she went the spinster route, becoming a lovable aunt to her nephews. If we let our gaydar guide us, as Middleton recommends, we can find that queerness. In recent years, despite the vast strides that the museum sector has taken to include more diverse voices, the limits of acceptability on a broader societal level have been shrinking, which affects museums, especially when it comes to social media, as they rely on social media to advertise and share their programming. With this reliance on social media comes the reliance on the algorithms that these sites use. And when it comes to sex and sexuality, it's been a massive thorn in the side of the museum sector, unaliving their capacity to reach a broader audience. The platform that you are watching this video on has a very well-documented, terrible monetization system, and as a result, many queer stories have been shadow banned, cancelled, or demonetized, simply due to the fact that they're queer. These Thems was a queer comedy series that was published on YouTube that was immensely well received. However, the series has struggled to remain on the platform as the arbitrary YouTube system has flagged episodes for nudity or pornography. The closest thing to nudity in this series is a dildo being shown on screen. But YouTube doesn't have an issue with New York Magazine's horniest vibrator scenes for film and TV video, or multiple creators doing sex toy tutorials and reviews getting millions of views. Somehow a comedy centered on queer and non-binary identities was just too controversial for the platform at the time. That time being February 2024, just a few months prior to this video being published. Again, I don't know if this video is going to stay monetized, so please check out the links in the description and subscribe and help. But to bring this back to museums, the Vagina Museum has been struggling with social media for years. If you've never heard of it, this is the world's first brick and mortar museum dedicated to all things vagina. trying to uplift and celebrate vaginas and vulvas from a progressive perspective. As a result of their subject matter, the Vagina Museum has frequently upset the algorithm gods. Like most museums, they use the name of their institution on their social media handles. However, the use of the word vagina has come with censorship, if they can even get it into their handle in the first place. TikTok does not allow the museum to go by their name. Facebook has prevented them from opening an integrated shop. Not even when they try to play by the rules and censor certain words, their posts are still at risk of removal. While they cannot confirm it, the museum does believe that they have been shadow banned, which is when a social media platform will hide content without fully removing it. This can prove to be really problematic when they're trying to host fundraisers or campaigns, such as in 2021 when they launched a campaign in response to a study that found a significant number of people had considered altering their vulvas. But when the Vagina Museum posted about the campaign on Instagram, it was flagged and removed for nudity. Here was a registered charity talking about and creating educational materials about normal functions of the human body being silenced because this verges too close to sexual content for the algorithm. And this is exactly what museums should be doing on social media, building platforms that raise voices and provide education in new and fun ways. But these social media sites are so nebulous that these activities can run afoul of the algorithms that run everything. If you want to check out this museum and what they have available online, or if you want to try and follow their social media sites, I've posted some links in the description. While the Vagina Museum is struggling, they are still on many of those social media sites. But if we look now instead at the Vienna Tourist Board, they decided to have a little bit of a playful protest a few years ago in response to the censorship that their museums have faced. In 2021, the Vienna Tourist Board started an OnlyFans account. Titled Vienna Laid Bare, this campaign was in response to multiple Viennese museums having posts, or in some cases their entire accounts removed for nudity. Even the Venus of Willendorf, the 250,000-year-old statue, was deemed too sexual for Facebook. The director of the Natural History Museum that houses the Venus of Willendorf in its collection claims that despite the label that Facebook applied to the artifact, they have never had any complaints about nudity. In creating the OnlyFans account, the Vienna Tourist Board was able to make a bit of a show out of sidestepping the censorship that they were facing on other social media sites. This garnered plenty of news coverage, drawing attention to the metaphorical minefield that cultural institutions have to walk through on social media. Here was not just one museum, but an entire city of museums, switching platforms in order to display traditional artworks. The censorship didn't stop there, though, because the Vienna Tourist Board could then not advertise their OnlyFans on the other social media sites because the links would become blocked. And it all just kind of furthered the need for this stunt. The campaign ended after a month, but in so doing, it started a global conversation about the censorship that cultural institutions face on social media. As Helen Hartlauer, a spokesperson for the Vienna Tourist Board, said, "Right now, an algorithm determines what is okay to see and what is not, and it definitely should not determine our cultural legacy. Not every museum has the strength or the resources to stand up to censorship like the Vagina Museum or any of the museums involved with the Vienna Tourist Board. Instead, many will just avoid those subjects entirely, preemptively self-censoring themselves and their content in order to not offend the algorithm. We are all made worse for it, as it means that these algorithms are dictating what we share, and the full breadth of human experience is cast aside and unalived." So what have we learned today? We have learned that museums originally catered to a strictly male gaze, and that women's positions were strictly relegated to office administrator or heterosexual fantasies on display. However, museum culture is changing as new voices are entering the field, and historical figures are being re-examined and interpreted in ways that are closer to their lived experience than ever before. We have also learned about censorship. overt and covert, and how it restricts queer stories, stories of the human body, and overall limits the breadth of human experience that is available to be on display in these places of education. Please bear in mind that this video is chipping one very small corner off of a very large iceberg. When it comes to sex, sexuality, gender, and museums, there is way more to discuss and read about. So Amelia and I have actually put together a list of interesting resources and things in the description of this video that you are welcome to peruse if you so wish. While museums and sex are often not considered in the same train of thought, perhaps they should be. These are, after all, places of education, civilization, and culture. And perhaps there is a bigger space available for these discussions of sexuality and gender than we originally thought. Thank you for watching. I hope you have a wonderful day or evening wherever you are, and I will see you next time.